right, friends, welcome to Surprising Things I Learned in Seminary that everybody should know. I don't think I knew what seminary was going to be when I went. I thought it might be kind of, I don't know, like Sunday school on steroids or something. Truth is, seminary, it's not like more Sunday school. Seminary is the stretching, testing of beliefs, learning the depths of what belief is about, what Christians have said over the years about these things. There's actually, in some ways, there's no secret mystical information that comes to you when you're in seminary, unless you read those big, thick books. But that's not even mystical information. All the big books are commentaries on the Bible. The one thing I think I realized when I got to seminary is I have not been a careful reader of the Bible. I'd read the thing. I thought I knew parts of it. But there's so much in there that's just obvious, and if you were to read it carefully, you'd understand a lot of what the big, thick books come to figure out. The other funny thing about the Bible that seminary helped me realize, we believe Scripture is inspired, but it's not always inspiring. King David, mothers, you don't want your daughters to marry guys like King David, right? He cheats on his spouses. He's a terrible father. He's not a good military. You don't want to be like this guy. So these aren't real inspiring people. It's one of the things I wrote a leadership book years ago. I was teaching a leadership course at Duke Divinity School, and I decided to write a book about it because publisher said, write a book on great leaders of the Bible. I don't know who they are. The leaders of the Bible, they're terrible. And if you put them in charge of your company, they'd run your company into the ground like in a week. Right? So how does all that work? So uninspiring things in the Bible and thinking critically about the Bible. So one thing that absolutely blew my mind when I got to seminary was learning in Old Testament class about Joshua and the conquest of Israel, right? The Israelites leave Egypt and they wander in the wilderness for 40 days and then they show up at the promised land and they come in, and the image I had, it was kind of blitzkrieg, like the Germans romping through Europe. They just annihilate the place and then they're in charge. And of course, one of the weird things about that is that we think, oh, that's so good the Israelites did that. We should always rethink these things, right? The United States took over this continent, and we could say that was a great thing. There was a lot of loss and suffering from the people that were here when they showed up, right? Russia's now invading Ukraine. That's not a good thing. Stories like, the Red Sea. The Israelites make it, and the Egyptian army follows in, and God drowns the whole Egyptian army. One of the rabbis in the Middle Ages said, should we rejoice over this? He said, no, we should weep. God's creatures were lost that day. So how do we rethink these stories? So the conquest of Israel, this is so interesting. We think Jericho, the walls came a-tumbling down, great song that we know, we cheer. That happened. I was very lucky that when I entered seminary, there was a sea change going on in how to think about the conquest and Joshua. And a lot of it had to do with this book by this guy named Norman Gottwald, great scholar, and it's called The Tribes of Yahweh. This is a 800-something page book with a small font. We jokingly called it the phone book. Nobody knows what a phone book is anymore, but that used to be a thing. Phone book, it kind of had the feel of a phone book. And this was groundbreaking scholarship when I was in school, and I can still see from the margins. I underlined, I wrote in the margins. I devoured this book day by day. And what's amazing about it is that what Gottwald's case is that it's not that the Israelites came in and they had a more powerful army than the Canaanites and just crushed them and took the land, or they came in and God was with them, so they just crushed them and took the land. What Gottwald argues, and he's not just looking at the Bible, but he's reading the Bible carefully. He's also looking at everything that we know from other cultures of the time and their history, what we know from anthropology. He puts all of this together, and what he says was going on during that time period is there was a social revolution. Now you say that today, and some people say, oh, we're always looking for social revolutions. Well, it doesn't mean that there's never been a social revolution. There was a social revolution. What was special about Israel is not that their armies were bigger or stronger than anybody else, or their God was bigger and tougher than anybody else. What was unusual about Israel in those days was their social structure. They had egalitarian beliefs. You didn't have like powerful people and poor people who worked for them. That was outlawed in Israel. Every other country, that's what they had. A few rich, many poor. The poor worked at the behest of the rich. They were enslaved to the rich. They were taken advantage of by the rich. Israel said, no, not where we are. This is a social revolution. Everything is egalitarian. Everybody gets some land. Everybody gets a crack at some land. Everybody gets to earn. We take care of the neediest in the community. We take care of the poorest in the community. This was revolutionary. And what Godwald argues is not that this mighty horde rolled into the promised land one day and took it over. In fact, he makes the case that's got to be right, is that the number of Israelites who entered the land from the outside was a very small number. Now, the book of Exodus tells us how many people fled Israel. It's 603,000 something. And that's just the men, not to mention women and slaves. It's a crazy number. That's a lot of people. Let's say it's just 500,000. How long would it take for them to cross a sea that had parted? And I've read numbers of this. It would take days and days for them to cross. That's a lot of people that's trying to move there. Plus, in Egyptian records, and they kept detailed records of every major thing that went on within their borders, there is no hint of one day 500,000 people took off. They would have taken note of that. So what Godwald argues, and anybody that's taken basic Hebrew would know the same thing, is the word translated 1,000 in Hebrew is the word elef, E-L-E-F. Elef later in its history means 1,000. Early in its history, the word elef doesn't mean 1,000. It means like, a small extended family unit. And what's the number on a small extended family unit? 12, 20, I don't know. So maybe 600 elefs, small extended family units, got out of Egypt and came into Israel from outside. Not all that many, a number, but not that many. So what Godwald argues is that small number of people somewhere out in the wilderness, they had an experience of God and came by this Mount Sinai, right? Came by the social revolution. When they came into the land of Israel, they didn't win by might, they won by how compelling their ideas were. And so Israel grew, not just because of those who came in from the outside, but there was a social revolution within Israel. People, Canaanites, start abandoning Canaanite cities and way of life, and they come over to Israel. You see what is happening there? And there's actually hints of this in the Bible. One example, Joshua chapter 2. When the Israelites come in, there's a woman named Rahab. It says that she's a harlot, a prostitute. We hear that, and we think, oh, a woman of low morals. I'll guarantee you, in ancient Canaan, a harlot was not a woman of low morals. A harlot was a woman who had been co-opted, who had been taken advantage of, who was forced against her will to do what she did not wish to do. Rahab, the harlot, is the first Canaanite convert to come over to Israel. Joshua 2 tells it right out in the open, and there had to be many, many others who do this. The beauty of this, it solves a whole lot of problems, right? Not just how many people came out of Egypt. There are also some archaeological problems. They studied ancient Jericho, and they were looking for those walls that came tumbling down, and the thousands of citizens of Jericho who died. But it turned out that during the time that Israel came to Jericho, there was almost nobody living there. The town had fallen into ruin. Well, how do you make sense of that and the walls come tumbling down? Well, probably later they exaggerated the story to make the walls come tumbling down. They'd already tumbled down. There were just a few people living there, and they heard about the Israelite revolution and said, we want in on that because everything has gone badly for us otherwise. It also solves these other problems is if you think about the Israelite conquest, we're talking about genocide and God's people being the ones who implement the genocide. They come in and they slaughter all these other populations. But if it actually is a social revolution, it was less about killing the inhabitants of the land than offering hope to the inhabitants of the land, a new way of living. You have no doubt that wars broke out because of this, and there was suffering and death because of it. One of the things that I've always believed, by the way, the Bible pretty clearly has God saying to the Israelites, destroy all those Canaanite people. Every one of them, destroy all those Canaanite people. Two things about that. One is angel warfare was brutal, and that was just the norm of how battles happen. You destroyed everybody. The other thing they knew in the ancient world is that if you tried to take over a city, but you had some survivors, you didn't totally burn the city to the ground, is that the water supply was toxic because of the battle, and there was so much that was left there, it became impossible to live there. You could only burn it down and start over and live again. And on the getting rid of the Canaanites, I firmly believe this. I don't think God ever told the Israelites, kill those Canaanites. And the reason isn't because that makes me queasy. The reason is the rest of the Bible bears witness to a God who never says slaughter another population. What I think the Israelites did is they came into the land, and if you look at a map, here's one of those being a careful Bible reader. One of the things that Godwalt does is he looks at a map. You know, I thought the Israelites came in and just conquered the whole land. No, they conquered just a small handful of cities. Most of the cities they did not conquer. There's still Canaanites there. And even in the cities that Israel conquers, there's still Canaanite neighbors. And that was a problem for Israel always, because they always had that temptation to worship the gods of the Canaanites. And they did it so often. Half the prophetic books are about that. The Israelites are being idolaters. They're worshiping the Canaanite gods instead of Israel's gods. It's the source of all their troubles. I think in retrospect, they look back hundreds of years later and they think, we should have gotten rid of those guys when we could. And pretty soon they were reading into that, God wishes we had gotten rid of all those guys when we could. You know, Rowan Williams wrote this great little book about Bible, baptism, and Eucharist. And then one of the things he says is that the Bible's not a go thou and do likewise book. Like, all these things in the Bible, go do these things. Go be like King David. No. Don't do these things, right? They're in the Bible to show us what not to do. Rowan Williams says that a lot of the stuff is in the Bible to show us how people misheard God. So you have Israelites saying, God, wish we'd steamrolled all those guys and had just killed them. They misheard God. Understandably, all of us mishear God. They just misheard it and they got it wrong. I love the idea of early Israel coming into the land as a social revolution. Christianity is itself a social revolution. When Christianity begins, it's not like they're mightier than the Romans. That's not the point. Christianity begins, and they have some unusual ideas. You read the book of Acts, they hold all of their possessions in common. There's no needy person among them. They're sure that no one is left out, that no one doesn't have the advantages of life that everybody else has. And that's part of the draw of Christianity. It's a magnet. People are drawn toward a society where everybody matters, where everybody is included, where everybody has got the basics that you need in the world. It was a social revolution. United Methodism. We began in England in the 1700s. It was a social revolution. It was about, getting children out of, labor sweatshops, working 12 hours a day and putting them in school. It was about decent health care for everyone. It was about racial equality and setting slaves free. It was a social revolution as much as it was a religious revolution. I absolutely love that. Again, each one of these sessions, I'm inviting one of my clergy colleagues to come in and share with you. I hope you'll enjoy this.
Hey, I'm Nathan Arledge, pastor of missions and community engagement. And I love to talk about the things that surprise me, especially today as we discuss the things that surprised me in seminary. And I want to start us off with Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. It says, "Come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I am gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light. This is why this verse matters. When I read the part that says, my yoke is easy to bear and my burden is light. That's what I want to focus on. I remember sitting down in my very first class of church history, a very intense class, a very pastoral and firm teacher of Dr. Warren Smith. And as he began to talk about what we were going to do, walking us through the syllabus, walking us through all the notes and how he was going to present, all the work that we were going to have, I sat back in my chair and I said, well, I was a history major in undergrad. This will be simple. I've got this. No worries. So I kind of just brushed it off. And then the class ended and I looked at my syllabus and I saw the amount of reading was more than I would have probably done in a year that was due at the end of the week. It was intense. It was challenging. It was reading things that I had never read before. It was trying to understand through a theological lens that I had never, ever attempted before, especially in an undergrad. That would have been the conversation. So when I think about the intensity of seminary, now as a pastor, years later outside of seminary, I give many thanks for that time. I give thanks for the challenge that was upon us. I give thanks for the stretching of our minds and our hearts that came to us. To go from this naive thought of, oh, I've got it handled because I'm a history major, to understanding the fullness and completeness of church history, to theology. Not that I understand it fully now. That's why we're always growing and always learning. But I appreciate that time because it pushed me. It challenged me. Something that you have heard me say before is I love to be a lifelong learner. I don't think we ever stop. We should never stop learning. We should always try to figure out what's more and more. And the surprise of the intensity of seminary really informs how we are supposed to approach our discipleship, to understand, to grow in knowledge, to think about what James was discussing with Jericho and the fighting and the killing and like, my gosh, why does that matter to our faith now? Why does that matter to us as disciples? Why does it matter for us, the ones who are called to follow Jesus, the ones who are supposed to honor the Hebrew scriptures? You have this violence, you have this peace, you have this humility, you have this all coming together, and it feels like this inward turmoil in our own heads of how to siphon out what is it that I'm supposed to do. It's intense. The thing that I would have us to remember is that we get to take on the yoke of Christ. Because it's intense, we have to take on the yoke of Christ. Because it's intense, we have to remember the Spirit that lives within us. Because it's intense, we have to remember God is with us always. The intensity that is our faith, the intensity that is our walk as disciples, is a gift. It's a challenge. One thing that I love about our church here at Myers Park United Methodist is that we don't invite you just to come in and leave your brains at the door. We want you to be stretched. We want you to have an intense experience. We want you to explore the scriptures in new ways that you've never thought about them before. We want to, as leaders, to experience the scriptures as we've never thought about them or considered them before, so that we are growing together, that we are thriving together, that we are finding ways to read the scriptures where it might be intense, of the killings and the fightings and the warfare that happened in the Bible and the times where God said, wipe them all out. And we're like, wait a second, how does that line up with the gospel message of Jesus? How does that line up with the love that Jesus is calling us to be about? And that we learn together, that we grow together, that we don't just sit back and say, I learned that in undergrad, I'm okay. But we say, I want more. I want to learn more. I want to grow more. I want to flourish more. The other aspect of seminary that surprises me in the intense way that it did was the designed community. The community that was formed, the community that was not formed, the community that you observed, the community that you didn't observe as a student there. And knowing that there are people who felt on the outside and there were people who felt on the inside, and people that felt welcomed and didn't feel welcome. And it was intense in many of the ways for everyone there. And I think, again, back to who we are as Christians, who we are as Christ followers, as disciples. What is the intensity that we are putting into our faith of welcoming people, of being fully inclusive, of fully taking it on our personal path each and every day, saying, hey, look, until somebody who doesn't feel loved by God knows that they are loved by God, that my work is not done. Until we can say that everybody truly has a place in our pews, that truly has a place in our Sunday school classrooms, in our small group settings, at our meal times, at our evening programs, whatever it might be, that we are intent and are focused, are driven to draw people to God's love. That we can recapture the spirit of reaching out in the name of God, who is of love and who is welcoming and who is compassionate and who is humble. That's the type of intensity that we're called about. That's the type of work that we have before us and the opportunity that we have as Christ followers. To set the table anew, if you will. To come to the table where everybody has a seat, where everybody is welcome, where everybody knows that we're going to be passing the same bread, the same cup, and say, hey, let me get that for you. And we live with that intensity because we know that we love one another fully. So friends, discipleship, it's intense. It's nothing we should take for granted. It's everything about our lives. Because when we are living with an intense discipleship, we are intent on getting God's love into our world, where everybody knows that they are loved, that God is with them, and that God cherishes them through and through. Thanks be to God.